Iran, the United States, and Israel stand at the center of one of the most tense geopolitical situations in the modern world. The confrontation appears contemporary, shaped by nuclear ambitions, military alliances, and regional influence. Yet many people claim that the roots of this conflict reach back nearly 4,000 years. According to this common narrative, the tensions we see today did not truly begin in modern politics, but inside a single family. The story, they say, began between two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, the sons of Abraham. From this perspective, the struggles of the present are simply the continuation of an ancient rivalry recorded in the book of Genesis. But does the Bible really support this interpretation? Is the conflict between Israel and Iran actually the extension of the dispute between the son of the promise and the son born to the servant? Or have we simplified a much more complex story? There is an important difference between what the biblical text actually says and what later generations have projected onto it. Ishmael received blessing. Isaac was chosen to carry the covenant. Yet nowhere in the biblical narrative is there a declaration of an endless war between their descendants. Even more surprising is another historical reality. The people known today as Iranians are not descendants of Ishmael. This raises an unavoidable question. How did this ancient story become connected to modern geopolitical tensions? How did Persia, a civilization that once helped liberate the Jewish people from exile, come to be viewed as a present-day antagonist? To answer this, we must separate myth from scripture, tradition from historical evidence, and biblical narrative from modern political interpretation. When we look carefully, the true origins of the story appear in a place very different from what many imagine. The story of Ishmael begins not with violence but with impatience. Abraham had received a divine promise that his descendants would become numerous like the stars of the sky. Yet years passed and Sarah remained unable to bear children. Eventually, a human decision altered the course of the story. Sarai offered her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abraham. In the ancient cultural context, this was a recognized practice. A child born from the servant could legally be considered the heir of the household. From that union, Ishmael was born. Even before Ishmael matured, a prophetic description was spoken about his future. In Genesis chapter 16 verse 12 it is written, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." This is the only direct biblical description concerning the character of Ishmael. If we read carefully, the text speaks about independence, tension between tribes, a nomadic existence, and the resistance to domination, but it does not speak about an eternal war against Israel. It does not predict a permanent persecution of Isaac's descendants. It does not describe a geopolitical conflict stretching across millennia. Instead, it describes the relation of tension and the life of a free and difficult man who would live among rival groups. And importantly, God does not reject Ishmael. On the contrary, the angel of the Lord promises Hagar that her descendants will be greatly multiplied. Later in Genesis chapter 17, God speaks to Abraham and says, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and increase his numbers. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." Ishmael is therefore not cursed. He is blessed. The difference is not blessing but covenant. Ishmael receives blessing, but Isaac is chosen for a specific covenant line. This distinction changes the entire interpretation of the story. For many years, Ishmael lived as Abraham's only son. He grew up in the patriarch's household, learning his father's traditions and receiving his affection. Only after the birth of Isaac did the separation occur. Yet even in that separation, God repeats the promise that Ishmael will become a great nation. Later, when Abraham dies, Genesis chapter 25 records an unexpected scene. Isaac and Ishmael stand together and bury their father. There is no description of battle between them. There is no narrative of war between their sons in that generation. The biblical account does not portray an immediate and permanent conflict between the two lineages. This naturally leads to another question. If the Bible never declares an eternal war, where did that idea originate? The descendants of Ishmael are not removed from history. Genesis 25 lists the names of his 12 sons who became tribal leaders. Interestingly, Jacob also later has 12 sons who become the tribes of Israel. Two parallel family structures emerge. The Ishmaelites spread across desert territories between Havilah and Shur, regions that served as important trade routes, linking Egypt and Mesopotamia. At this point, another detail from Genesis becomes important. When Joseph is sold by his brothers who transports him to Egypt, Ishmaelite merchants, they are traders carrying spices, balm, and myrrh. This detail reveals something significant. The early relationship between these groups was not one of constant warfare. It involved interaction, commerce, and tense but functional coexistence. Over centuries, the descendants of Ishmael mixed with other tribes of the Arabian desert. They eventually became part of the peoples known as Arabs. Yet the Bible never connects these tribes with Persia. This brings us back to the central question. If the Ishmaelites were not Persians, how did modern narratives connect them with Iran? When God announces the birth of Isaac, something fundamental changes. The blessing upon Ishmael remains, but the covenant lineage shifts. In Genesis 17, God declares, "I will establish my covenant with Isaac." The key word here is covenant. In Hebrew, the word is berith, referring not simply to prosperity but to a sacred historical mission. Through Isaac would come Jacob, the 12 tribes, the nation of Israel, and according to Christian belief, eventually the Messiah. The choice of Isaac was not a call to wage war. It was a call to carry a mission. Biblical election was never intended as permission for destruction. It was a responsibility. Israel was chosen to become a channel of blessing rather than an instrument of domination or hatred. This perspective radically alters modern interpretations. Often the idea of the chosen people is transformed into the idea of an eternal enemy, yet the biblical text does not support that conclusion. Isaac is never commanded to destroy Ishmael. He is never instructed to wage war against his half-brothers. The separation protects the lineage of the promise, but does not declare perpetual hostility. When Abraham dies, the two sons stand side by side burying their father. This moment was far more human and complex than the beginning of a civilizational war. Eventually, the descendants of Ishmael become desert tribes, merchants, and nomads, but the biblical text never links them with Persia. This is where the popular narrative begins to unravel. The most discussed modern conflict is not simply Israel versus Arabs, but Israel versus Iran. Yet the Iranians are not descended from Ishmael. So who were the Persians in biblical history? Centuries passed. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob became Israel. Israel grew into a people who experienced slavery in Egypt, the Exodus, settlement in Canaan, the rise of kings, division of kingdoms, and finally exile. Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, and the population was taken to Babylon. At that moment, it appeared that the story of Israel might end. But then, an unexpected figure emerged, Cyrus, the king of Persia. In 539 BC, the Persian Empire conquered Babylon. Instead of oppressing the Jewish people, Cyrus did something remarkable. He allowed them to return to their homeland. In the book of Ezra, his decrees record, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem." Cyrus permitted the return of the exiles, financed the rebuilding of the temple, and restored sacred objects taken by Babylon. Even more striking, Isaiah chapter 45 refers to Cyrus as God's anointed. A Persian ruler, not part of Israel's nation, is described as an instrument of divine purpose. At that moment, Persia was not an enemy but an ally in the restoration of Israel. Under Persian rule, Jerusalem was rebuilt, the temple was restored, and Jewish identity was preserved. This historical reality challenges the simplified idea of inevitable hostility. Persia governed differently from Babylon. Rather than forcing cultural assimilation, it allowed conquered peoples to maintain their languages, traditions, and religions. Archaeological discoveries such as the Cyrus cylinder confirmed this policy of restoring temples and returning displaced populations to their lands. For the Jewish people, this policy meant survival. Jerusalem was rebuilt, the temple was erected again, Ezra reaffirmed the law, and Nehemiah restored the city walls. All of this happened under Persian authority. The irony is striking. A civilization often viewed today as a modern antagonist once played a central role in preserving Israel as a nation. History therefore appears far more complex than the narrative of eternal enemies. Originally, Persia followed its own religious system, known as Zoroastrianism. Its culture and worldview were distinct from those of the Arab world. But in the 7th century, a dramatic transformation occurred. Arab armies expanding under the new faith of Islam conquered the Persian Empire. Over time, Persian society gradually adopted Islam. This change occurred not through descent for Ishmael, but through historical conquest and religious conversion. Persians remained ethnically different from Arabs, but religiously they became part of the broader Islamic world. Within Islamic tradition, Ishmael holds an important role as an ancestor of Arabians and as part of sacred story connected to Mecca and Abraham. Through faith, rather than genealogy, Persia became connected to a narrative that was not originally its own. Many centuries later, another transformation took place. In 1917, the Iranian Revolution replaced the secular monarchy with an Islamic republic. Opposition to the State of Israel became a defining element of its political identity. At this point, the issue moved far beyond the biblical genealogy. It became a matter of ideology, geopolitics, regional influence, nuclear programs, and strategic alliances. None of these developments appear in the book of Genesis. None of them originate in Abraham's tent. The modern conflict is therefore not the direct continuation of Isaac versus Ishmael. It is the result of centuries of political, cultural, and religious transformations. This leads to a final question. Why do people still insist on tracing modern conflicts back to that ancient desert tent? The reason may be simple. Humans prefer clear origins. We like stories that explain complex events with a single beginning. The idea that two brothers fought thousands of years ago and the world still suffers the consequences is emotionally powerful. But history is rarely that simple. Religious traditions, political movements, and national identities often reinterpret certainty and take essence often reinterpret circumstances. This happens not only in the Middle East but throughout the world. Ancient narratives provide depth and symbolism, but they can also be misused when treated as direct explanations for modern political conflicts. Isaac and Ishmael represent more than ethnic identities. They represent human decisions, the tension between waiting for a promise and trying to force outcomes to human effort. Ishmael is born from an attempt to accelerate the promise. Isaac is born through patience and fulfillment, yet both sons are loved. Both receive blessing. The biblical narrative does not conclude with a declaration of war. It ends quietly with two brothers standing together at their father's grave. After that moment, the text becomes silent. Perhaps this silence is intentional. The scriptures do not proclaim an inevitable conflict between modern nations. Instead, they offer a reflection on human choices, faith, and the consequences of impatience. The conflict between Israel and Iran today is real and complex, but it arises from modern political history rather than an ancient curse. Perhaps the deeper question is not who represents Isaac or Ishmael today. Perhaps the real question is whether we are reading the biblical text itself or using it to confirm narratives we already believe. When we return to the story carefully, we discover something surprising. The narrative often described as the beginning of an eternal war is actually a story about promise, human weakness, and two brothers who ultimately stood side by side before the same grave. And after that moment, the text simply continues.